Good afternoon, everyone. Phil Feldman from Sandata here. Welcome to episode 3 of the ins and outs of insourcing versus outsourcing revenue cycle management. Today is part 3, how to manage the vendor that you're working with, who should also be a partner, and what type of analysis you'd be looking for in order to ensure that you're getting the most value possible out of that relationship. So let's get into it. Just to recap the 2 previous episodes, part 1 was an overview. So we talked about what actually is outsourcing, what are the areas of your revenue cycle that typically you can outsource and it would make sense to outsource. Why would you want to outsource? What benefits can you hope to get out of an outsourcing relationship, both internal and external? And then how do we do a cost-benefit analysis or ROI, return on investment, for the outsourcing process and out of that relationship? So just a reminder, these sessions are recorded. And if you missed any of them, you can go back and take a look. Everyone who enrolled in the sessions would get one. If you need to get a link to any of these sessions, send me an email, phil.feldman@sandata.com, and I'm happy to get you the link to any of the prior sessions, including this one. So part 2, we talked about how do you select a vendor? How do you evaluate and qualify a vendor that you would potentially work with? What are the elements to that process? What are service models? Very important, statement of work. What are the varying types of service models and the types of pricing models that you can work with a vendor on, be it percentage of collections, per client per month, fixed monthly fee, hourly rate, et cetera, et cetera. We saw that really any of them can apply to any kind of an outsourcing relationship. It's all about what you're comfortable with and what you can get the vendor to agree to. And then the components of the vendor agreement. So what are the ideal components? What are typical components? And which ones are really ones that you want to make sure that you have in a vendor agreement as you work with them. So what we're going to talk about today is what's the process to work with the vendor in terms of managing that process and ensuring that you're getting what you need out of the process, maximizing the vendor's performance, and getting what your goals were that you intended to get. And mistake here. So really those other 2 are from the prior, but really today we're going to talk about the first bullet here, which is how do we manage the vendor and how do we manage the vendor process, the management of the outsourcing revenue cycle process. So really what we have is, we have what's a circle, because basically what you're doing is you're starting with an assessment, working your way through the process, going to planning, then communication, then reporting, then to feedback, and then going back into assessment again. Because what you're looking for is continuous improvement. You want to make sure that you are determining what your needs are, and the assessment process really comes out of, and the planning process comes out of the contracting process. So typically you would have had discussions with the vendor already. You would have provided the vendor with some information that allows them to assess what your challenges are. Obviously, you know a lot of what your challenges are already, and that's what drove you to consider outsourcing in the first place. I don't have the internal skills for this. I don't have the capacity for this. My priorities are elsewhere, such as managing the care of my clients, growing my agency, et cetera. But then you know where your pain points are as well. So, just determining where am I struggling, where are my challenges, why am I not getting out of my revenue cycle process what I need? And that's where the vendor comes into play as well, because they have the experience and expertise, not just to help resolve those issues, but to present issues to you that you may not have even thought about or realized. And that's what you want. That's why this is a partnership. It's not just a vendor-customer relationship where they are just basically sending out your bills and not bringing you any feedback, not bringing any intelligence to the situation, et cetera, et cetera. So it is an ongoing process. So once you assess, then you do your planning. What's our process going to look like? What information do you need? How will we address those challenges? And that leads you into communication. How are we going to communicate with each other? How frequently are we going to meet? What do you need from me as the customer, as the agency? What is it that I need to give you? What is it that I need from you? We've designed a statement of work that's presumably in our agreement. How do we execute on that statement of work? And is that statement of work even complete? So, as you go through the process, as the relationship matures, and you go through this on a week-to-week basis, and the weeks start to add up, that scope should adjust to what the real needs are, because nobody really knows what the ultimate needs are when you're going into a relationship. And hopefully you found a vendor that is flexible enough to adjust the scope to what you need. And hopefully you can be flexible enough for the vendor to provide them what they need to ensure that your processes are maximized and you're reaching your goals and their goals for you. And then going on to reporting, what kind of information is needed, both in the weekly cycle to ensure that as many claims as possible are going out the door on a weekly basis as clean as possible. And then talking about what kind of KPIs do you need, what's going to occur in the periodic meetings that you're going to have, typically weekly, and then moving to monthly, and also on an ad hoc daily basis. So what kind of reports are you going to get back in terms of what sections of the process they're reporting on? And then what kind of overall KPIs are they capable of providing? What can come out of your system? What can come out of any system that they might be using that can provide to you the information that you need and the subject matter of the conversations that you're going to have with them? And then the feedback. So what you're looking for both ways is intelligence to be applied to the process. So the vendor coming back to you and saying, look, you have potentially authorization, compliance issues, service issues. We're hearing back from your private pay customers that they're not completely satisfied with the service as we call them about their balances, and here's why they're not paying. As we work through your denials, where here's what we're seeing. We're looking at your edits that lead to building your billing files that are going out the door. What are the edits? What is repetitive? What can be adjusted earlier in your revenue cycle process and your operational processes to ensure that the largest files are created as possible, that you get the most claims out the door as quickly as possible, and that very few claims are hanging around after that billing cycle is completed and have to wait for the next billing cycle. And then ultimately the goal on both sides, obviously, is to get as many claims out the door as possible and get as many claims paid as possible, untouched by human hands. And when that's taking you around again, also is back to your assessment. So reassessing on a continual basis, where are we at? What's going on? Am I getting what I need? Is the vendor getting what they need? What changes have we made in our processes? What changes have I, as the agency, made in my intake process, in my authorization review process, in my service processes, scheduling, all of those items in the revenue cycle that occur prior to the creation of the claims. What changes do we make? Are those changes working? Are there any changes the vendor needs to make? So is there anything that they should be doing that will make the process work better for you and ultimately for your ultimate performance? So it's an ending circle, but it's not just a circle. It's not just one swim lane. You're not just swimming around in circles. Each of these points, obviously you're going to go back and forth between these different points. So you can have an infinite number of permutations and combinations in terms of how this cycle works. So what are the mechanics of the process? What are the things that you can expect in relation to this? So let's take a look. So the first two pieces of the process are assessment and planning. And what are those mechanics? What are the specifics that you can typically expect to do? So certainly when you get going with the vendor, you've signed your agreement, you've paid a one-time fee potentially, you're ready to get started, they're ready to get started. So that process typically starts with a kickoff meeting. So you are going to, and typically a vendor, you will want a startup checklist. So what are the checklists? What's included in the checklist? Certainly things like, I need copies of all your contracts. Best thing to do is for them to be electronic, scanned somehow, PDFs, create a folder that's a shared folder. So anytime you get a new contract or an amendment to a contract, that goes into that folder. The vendor is notified that there's a change, and they immediately can go into the system and set up what's necessary for, for that contract to be executed upon. They'll need to know the timing, they'll need to know the effective date, they'll need to know the details, etc., which they can get directly from the document. So those notifications should not be verbal. The contracts should be fully executed. So, and then also the vendor has the contracts to work with, because sometimes the vendor needs to actually present the payer with a contract, because the payer may not have it on file. So it's basically proof. It's used for confirming rates. It's used for appealing denials, timely filing, holding the payer's feet to the fire in terms of what their contractual obligations are. So very important that occurs. Then on an ongoing basis, copies of authorizations. Sometimes your system, and if the vendor is working in your system, if your system can ingest the auths, and the auths are stored electronically in your system, that's the perfect methodology for that. They're going to need access to all of those. So, and then, on the checklist, a list of payers, what documentation is needed, which payers require documentation to be attached to the claims. So the startup checklist will be specific to you, to your payer list, to the items in the statement of work with the vendor that they are obligated to and partnering with you to provide. And then who are the people in the process? Who are the process owners on both sides? So is there a multi-tiered relationship? So typically you would look to have a level in your organization dealing directly with a counterpart relationship in the vendor. So biller to biller, intake to biller, and so on and so forth. Cash to cash might be somebody in your finance department who would coordinate with the vendor as payments come in, so that the vendor can perform their reconciliations and anything else that they need to do with you. And that establishes the relationships in both organizations so that people can deal with each other as efficiently and effectively as possible. How do emails go back and forth? Are emails used? Who do I call? What are the phone numbers? Typically, a vendor will likely have a group email, because this way, you're not reliant on one individual, and vice versa. They may need you to set up a group email so that, if a biller is dealing with a biller, or somebody in your intake department is responsible for providing authorizations or answering questions on authorizations or scheduling with the vendor. Having an email address for them to send to you that goes to multiple people, to a group, is more effective, because this way, when people are on vacation, et cetera, it goes to someone. There's a human being on the other end who's looking at it, and vice versa. So if you have any questions or concerns, or if you need to provide information, then you're sending your email to a group address, and it's going to someone who can react quickly and completely to that. What's our process? What's our calendar? What day of the week are we going to get our claims out? It may vary by payer, depending upon the payer's deadline for making the next check run. It may be all on one day. So we close our payroll week on Sunday. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, we are resolving edits, et cetera, and on Thursday, our intent is to bill. So, working through that process, what's going to happen during that period of time? Well, on Monday, we're looking at the edits, and we're getting back to you. The vendor is getting back to you on questions in the edits. What day of the week are we going to get an expiring authorization report? What day are we going to get expired authorization reports? Everything building up to the ultimate day that we're going to bill. What day, how quickly are we going to get payments posted? What's the turnaround time in needing certain information? So there may be requirements placed on you as the customer to respond to the vendor within a certain particular period of time that's going to support the process that they're working on with you to get the claims out the door as quickly as possible, get payments posted as quickly as possible. What's our monthly process? So, when are we going to need to be reconciling our payments for the month? When do we need your bank statement? Or how frequently are we going to be accessing your bank account on a read-only basis to get the information that we need? So all of that goes into the process calendar planning. And then communication. So how are we going to communicate? Who's going to communicate with whom? What's going to happen on a daily basis? What's going to happen on a weekly basis? Typically, you're going to be looking for at least a weekly meeting at the outset of the relationship for the first few months, so that issues, challenges, concerns can be resolved as quickly as possible. Are there going to be meetings of subgroups? So is the collection team going to be meeting with the intake department to discuss issues that they're running into, denial issues, et cetera? Are we going to have a weekly meeting between management of the vendor and management of the agency to talk about how the process is working, what's going on, what's everybody seeing, are things getting better, are things getting worse, what's being resolved, what's not being resolved, et cetera? And then on a monthly basis, you want to have a meeting to go over the KPIs, the performance, what are the challenges, are there any payer projects going on, how is everything going? And then the report list. So what reports are going to be generated on each side? So for instance, expiring authorizations, you typically would want on a weekly basis. Edit reports, lists of items that can't be resolved, denial reporting, those types of things, issues reporting. So, and then on a monthly basis, KPIs, metrics, aging report, and things to get ready for your monthly executive meeting. And then hot list items. So what are items that we need right away in order to get started? So if the vendor is walking into a situation where you have maybe a backlog of claims that haven't gone out the door, maybe you have items in an aggregator that are claims that are stuck and there's a backlog of those. How do we jump on those, getting us access? So definitely access to the payer portals, access to the clearinghouses, access to the payment portals, access to the aggregators. Those are the things that need to be jumped on, but certainly anything that is extremely urgent from the standpoint of, hey, we have stuff that's going to time out if we don't jump on it right away. And vendor, you need to be looking at these items and working on these items first and foremost before anything else. What's needed to get that weekly claim file together? So those are the things that are part of this initiation process, part of the assessment and planning process. Now moving on to through the loop to communication and reporting. So we have our weekly calendar, and in terms of ensuring that the hours are going to be cut off. What's the deadline for cutting off the hours? If we need an extension, how long can that extension typically be? So that the vendor can do what they need to do to get your claim files out. How will the communication go if an extension is needed? What are the implications of not making that time? So having that hours cut off, typically which coincides with your payroll review, is very important. The edits review process, how's that going to work? So, the vendor will run edit reports, take a look at the edit, resolve what they can, get back to you on what they can't resolve. What's the turnaround time on your responses to that? Typically, could be immediate, could be 24 hours, could be 72 hours, depending on the type of edit and where you are in the process between the current time and the deadline for getting bills out. Special cases, how are we going to handle those? So single case agreements, private pay admissions, is there any special communication that's going to need to occur at that point in time? Because typically this stuff is real time. So, certainly a new private pay admission, there's an agreement, a private pay agreement, getting that into the file. What are the particulars of that? Is there a special holiday rate? Is there a special overtime rate? Are we billing them for transportation? Are the nursing assessment and supervision visits billable? How are we going to work changes on this client? Anything special about this client? Are we contacting the daughter instead of the client about claims? What's going on with that? And similarly in single case agreements, because we don't have a contract to back that up. So how is that going to work? Authorizations, what's the communication with regard to that? So when are we going to send you the expired authorization reports? Expiring authorizations, how far in advance do we need to know about them? So, your instructions to the vendor would be, I need to know 30 days in advance, so that because the timeline to get a reauth takes that long, and I want to make sure that we have the new auth in place when the old one expires. So those are things the vendor needs to know in order to be able to provide you with those reports to keep the billing process moving. How are we going to deal with rejections, both in the clearinghouses and the aggregators? What's the turnaround time to responses on claims that get hung up in either of those? The vendor typically can resolve a lot of them, but there might be some that they can't. Issues with eligibility. Is the vendor checking for eligibility? Are you checking for eligibility? How do we deal with those issues? And what's going to happen when we get a notification that a client has lost their coverage with a payer, their Medicaid certification, moving to a new managed care payer, going from Medicare Advantage to straight Medicare, et cetera, et cetera. How are we going to deal with all of that? What's the process? And then what's the cadence on a daily and weekly basis for this? What's our routine? How are we going to get into this process? Who is going to support it? Excuse me, on either side. What's their availability? What hours can you call them? How late are they? Excuse me, how late are they still in the office? Can I call them at 7 o'clock at night if a question comes up or a concern comes up to keep the process moving? What time do they get in the morning? What are their typical hours? Is it 7 to 3? Is it 9 to 5? And who's the backup? And then we work our way to reporting and feedback. So, reporting back on claims edit issues, which we talked about, reporting back on clearinghouse and aggregator rejections, payment discrepancies, denials. This is where the intelligent feedback comes in. So what are the issues that are being encountered by the vendor in response to submitting claims through the process? What are they seeing that's on an ongoing basis that could be impacted by operational changes, process changes in your shop that would benefit these items and prevent them from recurring, not just with the particular client or patient that they're seeing them with at the moment, but how can we prevent them for the greater client or patient population going forward? And then feedback and reassessment. So we're looking through all of these items here, claims edit issues, the rejections, all of the things that we talked about in detail and are talking about on a daily basis. What are we seeing? What can be benefited and impacted in your process, in the vendor's process? How can the agency make it easier for the vendor so that their performance is benefited? Any investment that you can make in time, effort, resources only comes back to you as the agency. So how can everybody do a better job? How can the customer do a better job in terms of applying intelligence to the process to prevent recurrence of all of these issues? And then how can the vendor react, respond, collect data, provide data, etc. And then some of the processes here, these last three items in particular, lead to those discussions. So having a claims tracker is great. So a claims tracker in its ideal state is a summary of a lot of the metrics and KPIs and aging data on a holistic level, on an organizational level, and then being able to take that and drill down to the details. So you're over 90 and you're aging, or you're over 60 and you're aging. Who do those patients, clients, payers consist of? So when we drill down to that data, we talk about that and what's going on and what are the projects that are going on. What are the issues that led to these challenges in the first place? Looking at the aging holistically. KPIs, what's my DSO? What's my average time from data service to creation of a clean claim? How does that work? What's that timeline? What's the process that we can use to reduce that timeline, to get the aging report looking better? So both you as the agency and the vendor have a vested interest in all of this, and what investments would be made in time, effort, intelligence, resources, etc. So coming back to this, we're talking about, this is the process, just as a reminder, and this is the process that we just walked through, and it's a continual process on an ongoing basis, both in the circle and back and forth between these various pieces. So just a word about Sandata Revenue Cycle Management. We are an outsourcing service of Sandata Technologies. You don't need to be in Sandata's system to work with us. We will work in just about any agency system that you're using, as long as you can get electronic claims out. The benefits are that your growth, you can invest time and effort in your growth. We're maximizing your payment performance. We're maximizing your revenue. So your profitability is benefited. And basically the bottom line is it's giving you the time to pursue the activities that you need to pursue in order to benefit your agency, to grow and to provide additional quality, the cash flow to make the investments that you need in care quality, and to just perform better as a whole as an agency and not have to worry about your claims going out the door. How am I going to make payroll this week? What's my cash flow? Any information that you need, you can utilize these links, and we're happy to provide more information, any questions, responses to any questions on this presentation. And thank you very much, everyone. Appreciate your attendance and look forward to hearing from you with questions, concerns, and feedback. Thanks again. Take care. Be well.